If you haven't heard the news, the Legends of Runeterra patch notes were released today. These are the patch notes for the upcoming 0.9.0 patch, and there are balance changes included in these patch notes, among some other cool, kind of like nifty changes, but naturally I'm going to talk about the balance changes and not just go through what was changed, but I kind of want to talk a bit about what I expect to be the end result of these changes, a little bit of analysis for what I expect the future will hold, because I do, if I'm being honest, feel like there were some pretty clear winners as a result of today's patch notes, and once this patch goes live, your meta is probably going to look a little bit different than it did before. So right out of the gate, they give you like this preview primer. This is basically like highlights of the patch notes in 60 seconds. They also include some dev notes, and I do think that some of these are worth highlighting. Specifically, they kind of talk about their mantra, if you will, right? So these are their kind of core tenets or beliefs. Every champion should have a deck where they're the best fit and their dream can be realized. Non-champion cards should have at least one deck where they're a good option. Now, this is very important because this doesn't say like an auto-include or ubiquitous, just they're a good option, right? You can make some changes based on playstyle or something. I think sometimes people think that every card has to be 100% like viable at the top of the ladder. And I don't think that's the case. I think that they just need to be a viable option, and that's kind of what they're aiming for here. Regions should have at least one competitively viable deck, and I actually think they've been doing a really good job of this, just personally, because I've seen a lot of variety in the like Diamond and Masters area. And finally, the meta should support the widest possible array of competitively viable decks. I understand what they're trying to say here, but I gotta be honest, wording it this way seems incredibly idealistic, because the widest possible array just mathematically means that every permutation of every deck possible should be supported and competitively viable, because that would be the widest possible array, like literally what I would call deck confetti, where you just take a bunch of cards, you throw them in the air, and then when you pick up off the ground, that's your deck, and that should be competitively viable. And I just think that's a bit idealistic. So I know what they're trying to convey here, but I just think this wording is a bit off. And I know that's me being nitpicky, but they also kind of talk about what their future cadence is expected to be going forward. So I want to highlight that real quick before we do the super dive in. So ideally, they're looking at something like new set of cards is released. Then after that, you're going to have a balance patch of mostly what they're calling medium-sized number changes based on an early sense of outliers. This is basically like, hey, what are the big things that might be like immediate issues, right? Second balance patch is significant updates to underutilized cards, and you can expect major champion updates. So this first one is like, hey, what are our knee-jerk reactions? And the second one is like, okay, we've got enough games under our belt, we feel confident about these. Then the third balance patch here would be a limited number of changes to stabilize any issues. I expect these to be small because things are kind of sunsetting, and then next set of cards released. And I also, personally, I think that this cadence makes a lot of sense from a design standpoint, because when you enter this phase, you're probably trying to internally focus on testing what this next set of cards is going to be. So I don't think that when you get to this point, you want to make a lot of changes, because you don't want to do something drastic here and then have it greatly change a new set of cards because you made some just absurd change here, right? Like, you want things to be stable before this comes out, because when you're doing any sort of experimentation and design, you need like a control and your variable, and the new set of cards should be the variable when you're entering this part. So I like this cadence. I think this makes a lot of sense. It's just kind of nice that they actually laid it out for us. That's very transparent of them, so bravo, Riot. A big fan of that, but this makes sense. They talk about the UI and deck builder and animations. I'm not going to go over that here. I would just recommend checking out the 60-second video, because they highlight some of them. Because let's be honest, we all want to know about the card updates. So right out of the gate here, Lux is getting a buff, and I am not shocked by this, because I think in terms of representation and power level, she was near the bottom, if not at the bottom as far as champions go. Her changes are essentially she's getting 1 power and 1 health at both stages, meaning her level 1 goes from a 3-4 to a 4-5, and her level 2 goes from a 4-5 to a 5-6. I do think this helps in her survivability, but the real question is, what else can you put around her? Lux finds herself, in my opinion, in a really weird spot because she's the kind of finisher that's competing with other finishers that are spell-based, and I think she's the most awkward of them just thematically. Now, you might be saying, well, what do you mean by that, Charmer? And I'm glad you asked that question. So, Heimer lets you play spells and then put just direct threats on the board. And so even if you answer the Heimer, you get the benefit of like the additional turrets that have to be dealt with, right? Ezreal allows you to level him up while he's still in your deck, so you don't even have to risk him being on the board until he's kind of went off, if you will. He's leveled up, and then you play him and you play a string of things and he's your finisher, right? Another spell-based thing. Karma can come down, but when she comes down, she provides an immediate benefit every turn until you're enlightened. And then again, even if you don't draw her until the late game, she comes down leveled up once you're enlightened and just does kind of absurd things in doubling your spell power, right? So when you're talking about spell-based decks, those are the three you're kind of competing with. And Lux here has to come down, survive long enough to see you spend 6 mana on spells, and most of the spells are not as good of a return on your investment as developing bodies, and I do think that that is a fine design decision. I've praised that in the past by Riot, because after all, this is a game about champions, this is a game about combat, and so you, I think, want to ensure that combat is happening. I actually really like the design of Heimer for that reason, because Heimer's benefit is that, yeah, you're playing a spell deck essentially, but it still comes back to a combat-based win condition, right? You make these turrets and then you win with the turrets. So you go back to what I think is a core tenet of this game, whereas Ezreal is kind of like the exact opposite of that in many ways, because he's almost strictly spell-based. Like, you could run a deck theoretically, I'm not saying that I recommend this, but you could theoretically run a deck that's just all spells in Ezreal and just never get into combat ever, right? Like, you could just slowly kind of stall and play control until you play Ezreal, and then just unload directly on the Nexus with a flurry of mystic shots and get exciteds and everything else. So Ezreal's a little bit more to the other end of the spectrum, in my opinion. But I really like Heimer's design. But back to Lux. So Lux here, she comes down and she has to see you then cast 6 mana worth of spells. So you have to invest 6 in her. And even with the better stat line now, right, you can maybe use her as a blocker for that turn. But you've got to kind of put her in peril. So she has to come down, then survive long enough to see you cast 6 mana of spells just to start getting the sparks. And then the sparks themselves kind of require your opponent to do things to get the benefit. Like, the sparks you can use to clear their board. The final spark has overwhelm, so sometimes it's a win condition by kind of nuking things and getting that extra damage. But like, if you're playing against that Ezreal deck and you have no targets for the final sparks, then they can be a bit clunky, right? I don't know. I feel like Lux is just still trying to find a home in terms of her design. I'm not saying she has to go all the way back to the drawing board, but I think that of the spell-based champions, she is the clunkiest. Another thing to note is that because she resides in Demacia, she, I think, has the hardest time making use of the spells as well. And what I mean by that is Demacia-based spells tend to be very combat-centric. They are temporary buffs, they are barriers, there are even things that force combat, like Judgment, and so on and so forth. Whereas in, Heimer and Ezreal, they're in Piltover, so you already have these direct damage options. And when you are in even Ionia, and you have things like Will of Ionia, it's like a defensive stall tactic that helps you get to the late game to utilize those spells. Your stall tactics in Demacia still require you to put bodies on the board. So you're kind of always in this weird scenario where you need to develop bodies to keep up, but you also need to have mana to play your combat tricks, and it's very hard to do both at the same time and then also develop a 6-cost Lux and then do those things. So my short version if you've listened to this full Lux rant up to this point, would just be that I think Lux is a bit clunky just from a design standpoint. I don't know if these extra stats will help her. I think that if Lux does find success, it will just be because folks really wanted to play Lux and really wanted to prove that she can be viable. And I'm not saying that she can't be viable. I just think she is clunkier than the other options. You could totally put Lux in some sort of like Karma Lux control deck and win with it, but I don't think that Lux is going to be like the linchpin. And as they talk about their design kind of wishes and tenets up here about every champion should have a deck where they're the best fit and their dream can be realized, I really struggle to envision that deck for Lux personally, because I think other champions kind of do her role better. And even in my opinion, like the dream is you play Lux and then you make a bunch of final sparks to nuke your opponent's board and swing for the victory. But even in doing that, right, every time you want to make one of these final sparks, you have to spend 6+ mana in spells. If I'm spending 6 or more mana in spells, those spells should already be nuking my opponent's board. Final Spark feels like such a win more card in those scenarios that I don't know that her realization of her dream is really worth the effort. So that's what I struggle with. And it was really rough because Lux is a champion that I really adore from League of Legends and I want to see her played. I just have a hard time envisioning her ever being a better option than the other things that exist. And she's also, one last thing, the one that's the most like anti-regional in her themes. Because again, Demacia as a region is very much about combat. And hers is not, right? Other than her having barrier, she's just not a champion who's really based around combat. She's a spell-based champion in a region where combat is king. Fiora is about combat. Garen wants you to strike, and then he triggers rally. Lucian has quick attack. He wants to get in, and he triggers rally when allies die, so you're attacking again. Lux is just not part of that. Again, you look at Demacia's things. They're buffs. They're combat initiators. They're barriers. Other than her having barrier, and some of the barrier cards on the art and on their theme are kind of based around her, her design is just not very Demacian to me. So, all right, I'm done with my Lux rant. She's just very clunky. Short version, she got buffed. I don't know how much is going to help in the long run. All right, Yasuo. Yasuo gets a buff. And the buff is that it is easier to level him up. And it used to be that you had to stun or recall 6 or more units to level Yasuo. It is now down to 5. And I actually really like this as a buff and as a change because I think one of the issues with Yasuo is in many cases you kind of felt pigeonholed into Yasuo only belonged in one deck, right? You played Ionia and you played Noxus and you ran every card that said stun and or recall and you just tried to find your Yasuo, and then once he came down he became like a machine gun for the board. I think that time will kind of tell here, right? I think that I got to do some testing, but this might be just enough of a buff where you're not forced to run Noxus and still reliably level Yasuo up. And that opens up in my opinion, a wealth of deck building opportunities, right? And I'm not saying that the Noxus and Ionia version is bad. It's certainly fun, but it just kind of feels bad that if you want to play a champion, there's literally just, you play this one deck, right? Without much variance. And I'm going to be honest, the Noxus one is probably still going to be the best version of said deck, and not even because of the stuns necessarily, but also because of some of the supporting cards and followers, specifically the one that grows every time something is, hit with a Yasuo-like effect. But at least you don't necessarily have to go Noxus. But other than that, not a lot going on here. I think Yasuo will maybe gain some popularity as a result of this, but I don't think that it's going to be enough in terms of power level to make a splash at the highest levels of the ladder. So we'll see. I don't know. This one I think requires a little more testing. It might just be consistent enough. I mean, that's the real key, right? If you can guarantee that you can consistently, by I will say like turn 7 or turn 8, play a level 2 Yasuo with your 3 or 4 mana left over to at least nuke one thing with his leveled up effect, then it actually might be worth it. But that's going to be the real test. That's going to be the key is, by, you know, mana round 7, mana round 8, can you consistently level up Yasuo to level 2 and draw him with an activating effect? All right, that's it for champions. So now we're on to other balance changes. First up is back-to-back, and this is not a shock. If you watched any of my deck guides where I included back-to-back, I said several times that this card was an insane amount of value at its cost, and that I could very easily see it at 6 cost or some other restrictive effect where the 2 units had to be next to each other on the field. Think like a unit and its supported ally. But they went with 6, and again, that makes sense because you're paying 6 for essentially 6/6 in stats. It was a bit undercosted at 5. I think that in many ways, this is still playable. And even though it is overall a buff, I do want to highlight one thing because I was just talking about it. This is kind of a buff to Lux, because she requires you to play 6 mana in spells to get a final spark. And so before, if you played Lux and then you used back-to-back in combat, that was still not enough to get at least 1 final spark. But now, believe it or not, because this was nerfed, it buffs Lux, and that if you drop Lux and then on your next turn you go into combat and you play a back-to-back, you're guaranteed to get at least 1 final spark. So don't sleep on that interaction. This is a minor buff to Lux and an overall nerf in every other situation. So next up we have Arena Battlecaster. This is interesting to me because this is a card that is supposed to be, I think, a supporter of go wide strategies. It was not seeing a ton of use at 1 health because it was very brittle. Not only does it mean that anytime anything blocks it, basically it was going to die, but it was susceptible to things like, you know, the Vile Feast and a few other of the like 1 health pingers. So it's going up to a 2/2. I think this is entirely reasonable because at a 2/2 stat line, if you have 1 other unit, and this costs 2, right? So if you have 1 other unit, it's like paying 2 for a 3/2 when you're attacking. And then you've got upside where if you've got, you know, 3 or 4 units, maybe it's a 5/2. But considering Noxus has ways to pretty consistently just drop you a 5/1 or a 5/2 unit in general, I think that this is fine. In fact, even with this change, I don't think that you're going to see a lot of this unit. You might see more. This might actually intrigue enough folks to maybe include this in the Noxus Spiders list or things like that. But I don't think that this is going to necessarily like take over the meta either. But this is fine. I think this is a welcome change. Next up, we have Crimson Curator. This also got a buff where it gets 1 additional health. This is part of a series of cards that basically say, like, when I survive damage, I do something. And there's those cards in Noxus, and there's those cards in Freljord. And there's kind of, they have it highlighted here, Battle Scars is what they're calling it. There's this kind of like underlying theme between the two where you run a bunch of cards that, you know, deal 1 damage to everything. So things like Vlad, or there's a few other effects. And then the idea is that if your units survive, then they get some sort of tangible benefit. This one was always, I think, handicapped because I don't think they wanted it to be too much of a draw engine. So it was a 3/2 because if it survives damage, it creates a random Crimson unit into your hand. And I can understand that fear, right? You don't want to create something that's just going to be an endless value engine that is very easy to play and protect. However, that 2 health was very much a liability because that means that it trades into just about any 2-drop, a lot of 1-drops. It meant it was very susceptible to Mystic Shot. Like, there was a number of reasons why you were going to play that card and never get any benefit from it. So at least now here, they're saying, like, okay, you know, if something trades into it for 1 or 2 and then you Mystic Shot it, at least you got to get the 1 card out of it. And I think that's the sweet spot they're aiming for. I think on average, they want you to get 1 extra card out of this, and then sometimes you get more, and that's a feels good moment, and sometimes it gets shut down and it feels bad. But I think they kind of want you to average always this just replacing itself. And I think that this change will help that. All right, now some of the controversial ones, right? So first up, Deny. This is now a 4-mana spell. Deny did, in fact, get nerfed. And this is kind of a big deal. I'm not going to say that Deny didn't deserve it, but Deny was already very much, in my opinion, a high risk, high reward card. It was a very boom or bust. Because a lot of times you were stuck using a Deny to try to shut down somebody's like Glimpse or their Vile Feast. And did that help? Sure, but like it's not really impactful. And there was a lot of times where Deny just sat in your hand because people wisened up and they started running burst spells. And you can say that that's directly because of Deny. And Deny has something to do with that. But the reality is people just don't want you responding to it, period, right? I don't want to run a fast spell that does something when I can run a burst spell that guarantees to buff my units before you ever get to try to Mystic Shot them. So Deny isn't the only reason that you should prioritize burst spells, but it's certainly something that contributed to it. So really, the only time that Denies were really backbreaking were when you were going for a kind of like big late game flashy spell. But I've always felt like those should be very high risk, high reward spells anyway. And so being susceptible to Deny felt normal and natural to me. Like you shouldn't, at least in my opinion, you shouldn't be able to play Ruination without thinking about it, right? Judgment shouldn't be something that you're just not considering like potential answers or responses to. These are big, expensive spells for a reason. And so I think that Deny and its existence is very healthy for the game. I think that it was probably fine at 3. Maybe it was just a bit too popular. This might be one of those adjustments that's due to popularity over power level, just to kind of get people to try other things. But doesn't matter because it's 4 mana now. And so this very well could dramatically change the landscape. It's also entirely possible that this change was in part as well related to expeditions. So we'll see. See, it's really interesting to me because they're saying in their notes here, right, that it's heavily restricting viable card options. I'm personally of the opinion that I don't think the card was restricting. I think people's fear was restricting certain card options, because I was very much somebody who was advocating for more people to play Judgment from the get-go and saying that I think people are too afraid of Deny. And I felt a bit vindicated when Hyped, wonderful fellow from Team Liquid, when he hit Masters, he posted his deck list, and he was running a control list with a lot of lifesteal and 3 copies of Judgment. And somebody asked him on Twitter, they said, man, 3 copies of Judgment, like, aren't you worried about Deny? And he said, not even a little bit. I'd run 4 if I could. And I was so happy because I really feel like a lot of the times people overestimate Deny. Because the reality is, through the natural course of a game, before you get to those late game spells, you're probably baiting out at least one Deny. And so they have to likely draw their second one for the first time you use your big spell. And even if they shut that down, then you might be able to follow it up with your second, right? Like there's this kind of cadence and ebb and flow to games. And I honestly felt like people were far too afraid of Deny, far too fearful. So again, I don't know. We'll see. But I expect things to be a bit of a Wild West, because you're going to have a bunch of folks that basically just cut this. They're going to think that it's not good enough now. And you're going to see all sorts of stuff resolving. So I don't know. We'll see if this ends up being better or worse for people's sanity. I'd much rather live in a game state where Deny is something where you're at least considering it, as opposed to just like, am I dead to atrocity every other turn? All right, next up we have Inspiring Mentor. This was a 1/1, and it is now a 1/2, but the ally that it is buffing now only gives +1/+0, not +1/+1, and this is massive. This is a big deal, because one of the things that elusive decks very much relied on was Inspiring Mentor to get your primary threats outside of the 2 damage range, specifically Mystic Shot, but even some other cards as well. And even in the case of something like the Duo that has 1 health, trying to get that outside of Vile Feast range was also very, very relevant. And it's not just the elusive units. I know that here they mention going into a 4/3 Navari Conspirator was a powerful play. But the reality is like this saved your Zed as well. Zed was really ramping up in popularity recently, and I think that this hit to mentor really slows Zed down. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but there was already play patterns that was existing that kind of required mentor to keep your key threats alive. Losing the health here is huge. Do not sleep on that. This is making those decks very disruptible. Avalanche might be coming back now. It's going to be, I think, a very strong potential play against aggressive lists anyway. I don't think it'll be a great play against the lists that I expect to dominate the meta after this patch, but yeah, this is a huge nerf. Here we have Jeweled Protector. It's up to a 4/4, and it still grants an ally in hand +3/+3. This actually might be enough to get this considered for constructed play. I'll certainly consider it a lot more in expeditions now, but the extra health and the extra power are both kind of a big deal. It gets some better favorable, more favorable trades. It takes it outside of Black Spear range. In all honesty, it just makes it so that it doesn't trade into a bunch of 2-drops. There's nothing worse than paying 5 for something. Yeah, buff something in your hand, right? But I'm paying 5 now, and I'm going to lose the unit I just spent 5 on to like a 3/2 fearsome that costs somebody 2 mana. And then I'm going to play whatever I buffed last turn the following turn, but by then my opponent's like already developed relevant threats. Like, you're just so far behind. The 4/4 making it so it doesn't trade into 2-drops for the most part. I mean, Curse Keeper after it dies, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, like, it doesn't trade with 2-drops anymore and die, and it's outside of like Get Excited range, Black Spear range. I think this might be enough where I would at least consider it. Again, I don't think it's going to magically take over the meta because of this change, but I think it's far less of a detriment if you include this now. And it might be necessary because with the mentor nerf getting in here, and now we're coming down here, Kinku Lifeblade. I expected this one to get adjusted. I am not shocked by this. But when you take this into account with like every other change that's coming, this is a pretty big deal. So Lifeblade is now a 2/2 where it used to be a 2/3. And again, that 1 health point matters because Mystic Shot is certainly a thing and Avalanche is a thing, and it's just much easier to deal 2 damage than it is to deal 3 damage. Certainly as far as like elusive units go, the duo doesn't even need to get its trigger to trade into this. The 2/2 cycler can trade even with this now. This 1 health change is a very massive change to the survivability of Lifeblade, and so you can just add it to the list. It's going to be interesting. This plus the mentor nerf and the deny nerf is really hitting elusives and Ionia hard. All right, so next up we have Ledros, and cost goes up to 9 from 8, but it's now a 9/6 instead of an 8/6, and then they just clarified the text. So if you didn't know before, Ledros always rounded up when he dealt damage. That meant that if you were at 1 health, you could actually die to Ledros. All they did was clarify that in the text. That's where it says old text, new text. This is not an actual buff. It already worked this way. This is just a clarification. Probably because of folks like me who used to kind of laughingly and jokingly complain every time somebody would play Ledros and be like, oh, I don't know why it rounds up. Well, now it just says so on the card. But the big news here is that it comes down a turn later, but it's also got more power. And they talk about how they wanted this to be a finisher, and basically, like, if it connects, it should end games. But they also wanted it to be a bit more risky. So, in other words, like, by moving the cost from 8 to 9, by the time you're playing Ledros, you know that that's like your entire turn, right? Your turn is I'm playing Ledros and I'm not doing anything else, and I'm just hoping Ledros finishes the game. I think a lot of decks that were running him before probably still do run him just as a one-of. He's still very good at closing out games. It's just 1 turn later. But the 1 turn later is relevant because, and you'll see in a moment, there's potentially some 8-drops that you'll be running that you weren't running before. Well, you were running before, just not in the 8 slot. And that's Rasa. So Rasa basically just goes up by 1 in cost. And they mention consistent blowout potential. It's a bit interesting to me, and I'll say this because in terms of the identity of cards, I'm now struggling to see kind of like what the difference between these two are. And what I mean by that is that at this point, once you get up to the 8 and above range, in my mind, you're all finishers. And I would say, like, for example, there's the Noxus 8 drop that turns your entire hand into decimates and has overwhelm. Like, that's meant to be a finisher, and that's an 8 drop, right? In my mind, once you get to 8 and above, you're trying to close out games. Specifically at 9 and 10, because you're turning on enlightened things and you're taking up your entire turn. But even really at 8, 8 is when the game really starts to ramp up in terms of pressure, in my mind. And you could say Rasa's a bit of a finisher, but Rasa, like, functionally hasn't worked that way in the current meta. There's kind of this weird cat and mouse game you play, or at least there has been, where once you get to 7, you're playing around each other's Rasa, trying to be the person who plays Rasa second, essentially. That can still exist, and it's just a turn later, but now you're in finisher range, right? So my opponent could, like I could set something up and then my opponent plays Rasa and I'm like, that's cool. And then, you know, I play an 8/8 overwhelm and I change my hand over to decimates. One of us is going to finish the game and the other one, like, kind of cleared my 2 weakest things. Don't get me wrong. I felt Rasa was insanely powerful before. I am not shocked that they changed Rasa at all. It's just interesting that the change they made wasn't like reducing his size or even reducing his effect, but it was increasing his cost. And so now Rasa kind of falls into like this finisher range. Now you could argue that maybe he's supposed to be in that sweeper range because there are a lot of cards that cost, you know, 7, 8, or 9 that are meant to kind of clear the board, right? True Shot, Barrage, Judgment. But Shadow Isles already has that, right? Like, that's Ruination. So again, from an identity standpoint, like, I don't know if this is supposed to be my sweeper or my finisher, but Shadow Isles kind of has 2 units that fill those roles a little bit better now, or more consistently. I think Rasa's still good. There will definitely still be decks that run Rasa. I just think Rasa's, with these changes, got a little bit of an identity crisis going on. This is a big change. I was actually really surprised Scurvy Geist wasn't seeing more play already, and I think that it will absolutely be seeing play going forward. So it saw a lot of play during the preview events. This is a 5/5. It has gained the keyword fearsome. Now it has a cost of 10, however, it reduces its cost by 1 for each ally that's died this game. Now, this is a cost reduction whether it's in your hand or not. So if you're running, you know, an ephemeral aggressive list, and you've had, you know, 2 Shark Chariots die, you know, you've used 1 Relic, and you've attacked once with Hecarim, right? Like, then this becomes a 4-cost 5/5 fearsome. Like, this card is very easy, in my opinion, to get to the point where you're making this at a cost-effective play and getting a lot of value out of it, and the fearsome is a pretty big deal, so I think we might see a spike in this, especially because I think aggressive lists that were running this might actually, if they don't cut it, I think they'll run less Rasas, right? Instead of just like jamming in 3 because you could. I think you might see less of these, and you might, depending on the list, you might see some more Scurvy Geists pop up here or there. We'll see. Tortured Prodigy. This goes from a 3/4 to a 4/4. I mean, I'm not surprised by this. I think that this card is still in a weird spot. So when an ally dies, you refill your spell mana, and that's really cool, and it's certainly very thematic, and it fits in the Shadow Isles themes. But I think the card struggles from the fact that Shadow Isles isn't really considered like the spell-based class, and most of your spells are kind of already expensive, which is maybe where this gets its benefit, right? Like, maybe you're playing a body, and then when you kill your small unit, you're kind of using this as ramp to ramp into something expensive. But this card has always kind of felt a little clunky to me, and I think that it feels way worse in Expeditions. Like, this card just feels bad in Expeditions. So we'll see if this is enough. I'm not sure that this is enough of a change for this to gain too much popularity. All right, the last card that was officially changed this time around was Wraith Collar. This is exactly the change I expected, which is it loses Fearsome. So it's still going to generate a lot of stats. I think that you'll still see Mist Wraith decks. I think that the top end will change a little bit for them. But overall, like this is losing Fearsome. The Mist Wraith keeps the Fearsome. It's still a lot of stats. This is fine. This is what I was expecting. This is not a huge deal. All right. So they mentioned the watch list here as well. They talk about Fearsome, and they talk about how the central pattern of the game is supposed to be built around interactive and interesting combats. And I talked about that up at the top when I was going on my rant about Lux, right? Like, this game is based around combat, and they re-acknowledge that here. So they're keeping an eye on elusive decks and made some changes to them because they didn't want you to just be ignoring combat altogether. And they're saying in large concentrations, Fearsome can have a similar impact. And again, I think that's part of the reason why we kind of see this change here. So they're going to keep an eye on it. The good news is that at least with Fearsome, you have more counterplay options, which is why I'm less concerned about that, because you can't, use a combat trick to buff your unit and then magically block an elusive unit, right? Unless your combat trick is Purify on their unit, that's just not happening. But you can do things like, put a +3/+0, you can use a twin disciplines on your 1/1 spider and then suddenly block a Fearsome unit, right? Like, that kind of interesting dynamic, I think, is a bonus for Fearsome from a design standpoint. So they're keeping an eye on it, but I think ultimately it's not going to get touched nearly as much as elusive. And then control. So collectively, the card updates in this patch represent a general reduction in the power of tools that aggressive and mid-range decks have to combat control strategies, specifically ways to reach inevitability. While control decks haven't been problematic so far, we'll be keeping an eye out. Yes, you need to keep an eye out, because here's what didn't change. So I was talking about how there's some clear winners. When I'm looking through here, you know what I see? I see no changes to the Piltover control lists. I see no changes to the Karma control lists. So guess who's going to be popular, gang? Ezreal. So the Ezreal, Piltover, and Freljord decks that were already gaining traction, already gaining popularity in Master and in Diamond. In fact, like the last time I played against that deck more than any other list. Not Mist Race, not Elusives, it was Ezreal Control, and it was damn good already. And now you've got no changes to that deck, and you've got combat tricks becoming more expensive. Your denies to stop their control tools going out the window. Guess what? A lot more things are stuck at 2 health now because Inspiring Mentor is not buffing health. And not only are things stuck at 2 health, but you've got more things at 2 health, and so on and so forth. You need to expect Piltover to be very, very popular after this patch. You need to expect Ezreal and Heimerdinger and potentially Karma as well. All of them are, I think, going to be far better at like stalling to their late game, and even in terms of just general stalling, right? They didn't touch Hecarim, but Rasa's a little bit slower, Ledros is a little bit slower. As they said, overall, these changes are hitting aggressive strategies and mid-range strategies. So I expect your big winners to be Piltover-based control, right? Some combination of whether it's Ezreal, Heimerdinger, Karma, or a combination of 1 to 3 of those decks will be popular and probably pretty powerful. The other lists that weren't touched that you might want to keep an eye out is the Frostbiting 5s. I don't know what the official deck name is for them. I call it the Frostbiting 5s. Basically, things that have 5 or more attack power. It's a Noxus and Freljord list that utilizes Ash, Frostbite effects, but then also takes advantage of the Trifarian Assessor, right, where you just draw a bajillion cards as well. Like that deck is very good at applying consistent like mid-range pressure because everything's swinging like a truck because they have 5 attack power, and if they start to run out of resources or slow down, they just refill their hand. So that one might rise to kind of be maybe one of the new, if not the new, like prominent mid-range list. But definitely 100% like Piltover is looking really good right now. They've got a lot of tools that got better, and they've got a lot of the disruption cards getting nerfed. So deny, back-to-back, etc. The things you would use to protect your threats. Yeah. Those are the winners in my mind. They were already kind of creeping up in power level. The minute people realized how good Mystic Shot was in a Mist Wraith and an elusive meta, because essentially anything you weren't mentoring, your elusive units, your Zeds, anything you weren't mentoring was going to potentially die to Mystic Shot. That was a big deal. Similarly, the Mist Wraiths, like when they get hit, etc., etc., Mystic Shot was well positioned. As I said, I think Avalanche is also potentially well positioned going into this next patch, but the reason I'm far higher on Mystic Shot is because that can be used as a win condition with your units like Ezreal, because it can go straight to the Nexus, and Avalanche only clears the board, and Avalanche, if everybody's playing Ezreal and Heimerdinger lists, then Avalanche is basically just going to clear turrets and not be used for much else, whereas Mystic Shot has a lot more uses, right? So you might see more Avalanche sprinkled in, but yeah, Piltover control lists, you should expect to see a bunch of them one way or the other. I mean, these were lists that were already doing good in the meta. I know they said that it's not problematic, but I think that was due to popularity, not power level. Because even today, so as I'm recording this, February 17th, Raptor, aka Josh Utter Layton, you may remember him from being a Magic Pro or from a card designer on the Elder Scrolls Legends, whatever the case may be. He hit #1 on EU with a Heimerdinger list. And I know lots of folks that were playing Heimer, 2 Masters, in Masters, same thing with Ezreal. Petrify and I had a great conversation about the inclusion of Elnux in the Ezreal list, and he was getting really close to top 10 with that. Like, these are lists that were already powerful before these changes, and they're going to get quite the addition by subtraction to these other lists. So we'll see. I hope other stuff rises up and competes with it, right? But like the initial fear, right? The knee-jerk reaction, and that's what everybody enjoys anyway, right? Like, it's my job to kind of hyperbolize a bit here, but the knee-jerk reaction is all hail our new Piltover overlords, because it sure seems like they got a pretty big buff. Anyway, that's it. If you made it this far, I appreciate you hanging out. I want to hear what you think of the changes. Do you think it was too much? Do you think it was too little? There are also some expedition and XP changes here as well, other things, but this video is already going to be along with me just covering the card changes, so come check this out. I'll include a link to the full patch notes in the video description, so you can just click on that instead of hunting for it if you have not read them. Yeah, I appreciate you. I want to know what you think of the notes, what you're excited to play, what you're excited to try. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I will catch you watching future videos. I'm supposed to do that YouTube thing where I say like, subscribe or whatever, but I always feel bad when I do that, so just do it so I don't have to say it. If you guys keep doing it, I won't have to say it. So just, do your thing.